Hi everyone that's joining. We're just gonna be with you in just a few minutes and let everyone jump in first. Hi everyone, the webinar will be starting shortly. We're just going to give it another couple of minutes to let everyone drop in, and then we'll be hearing from our speakers. Everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the first SMMR webinar. We are very excited to have three awesome speakers talking about transdisciplinary and diverse values, WetlandLIFE, SMMR and beyond today. They are going to be talking, the people that will be talking are Dr. Tim Acott, who specialises in exploring interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to understanding cultural values. Dr. Victoria Leslie, who is a research fellow at the University of Portsmouth, exploring diverse values in the marine environment. And Dr. Frances Hawkes is a senior research fellow at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich, specialising in insect vectors of disease, incorporating multi and transdisciplinary approaches. We are going to be talking, they're going to be giving a talk for the first half of this session, and at the end we're going to have a Q&A. So if anyone can put any Q&As in the Q&A section of the Zoom, that would be fantastic to keep them all there, and any comments or anything else, put that in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. This is going to be recorded, so if at any point anyone has to drop out, it's going to be on the SMMR YouTube channel, so you can go and check that out later. And one final kind of plug from us on the SMMR team before we start is we also have the SMMR Conference coming up very soon. It's going to be in person in Bristol from the 9th to the 11th of May, but it's also a hybrid event, so we'll also be online. So that's just something to keep your eye out for, and we would love to see you there. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and the rest of the session. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand over to them.
Thank you very much. What a great introduction, and thanks so much for being invited to do this first SMMR webinar. We're going to be talking about transdisciplinarity and diverse values, WetlandLIFE, SMMR and beyond. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in there, and there's a lot of bits and pieces to this. So I thought we'd start off by just perhaps giving people a little bit of a feeling for what WetlandLIFE was, what the SMMR program is, and a little bit of background to sort of transdisciplinary and diverse values before we kind of kick into a conversation. So after an introduction, we're really going to have almost like a bit of a discussion between Frances, Victoria and myself. So Frances Hawkes, she worked on the WetlandLIFE project, and she is an entomologist. She specializes in mosquitoes. So she's got brings a really interesting perspective from the background of the natural sciences. Victoria, she also worked on the WetlandLIFE project as an artist and creative writer, and she is currently working as a research fellow on our current Diverse Values SMMR projects as well. So the idea really here is that we look a little bit at the WetlandLIFE project and think about what we did as part of that project and how that has kind of informed, and the learning from that is kind of being taken on into our Diverse Values SMMR project, and then thinking about where we might go beyond that. So if I could have the first slide, please. So just a little bit of background about the WetlandLIFE project. So this was a UKRI funded project, ran from 2016 to 2020. It was funded at just over £1 million. So it's quite a large project. It was interdisciplinary, and the focus was to build an understanding of mosquitoes in wetlands, but in relation to natural, economic and socio-cultural values. So I think you can see immediately there that we're starting to talk about the importance of this these kind of diverse values, this idea of bringing multiple values, multiple perspectives together. In the case of WetlandLIFE, we were working across 12 case study sites across lowland wetlands in England, from the Lower Otter Estuary in the southwest all the way up to Alkborough Flats in the northeast. Next slide. And I think an important part of this project, obviously we had a number of different partners, including University of Greenwich, Cranfield University, University of Bristol, etc., University of Brighton. But we also importantly had Public Health England as a partner. And I think that working between the academic partners, Public Health England, Forest Research, really kind of aided that our approach to interdisciplinarity. So again, just to kind of give you a sort of flavour of the outline of the project, on the left-hand side there, we've got a kind of summary, if you like, of the project, and there you can see the kind of the continuum of different perspectives that we drew upon. So from the natural sciences, so the ecology and mosquitoes. Oh, there's a little red spot. Excellent. Thanks, Francis. The magic of screen sharing. Going from the sort of natural scientists, sort of positivism from the one side, through the social sciences, both quantitative and qualitative, economics, CVM interviews, into the whole sort of creative social research methods and sort of research-based art. And those sort of diverse approaches resulted in a sort of diverse set of outputs that gave us evidence of mosquito distribution and control, gave us information about eliciting of shared values of wetlands, but also, more importantly, on that sort of right-hand sort of column there, they helped us to think about how the arts and these sort of creative social research helps us start to create narratives and understand narratives and empathy for wetlands as well. And these kind of the outputs sort of emerged into the Wetland Mosquito Survey Handbook, which is now being used by wetland managers and Public Health England, and was an amalgamation, very much an interdisciplinary output of the evidence, if you like, the evidence of the mosquito distribution, the natural sciences, but also within that then the cultural and social and more sort of creative aspects as well. And then the final project report, The Wonder of Wetlands, where we'll talk in a little bit more detail about these in just a minute. So hopefully that's given you a very quick idea about the WetlandLIFE project. So moving on. So that was completed in 2020. And then I'm involved in the SMMR Diverse Values project. Steve Fletcher, Professor Steve Fletcher from the University of Portsmouth is the PI from that. And I'm a co-lead, and we wrote the project and designed the project very much as a sort of combined collaborative project. And again, this is a UKRI funded project, about 1.8 million. It's transdisciplinary. Transdisciplinary is very much in the aims and objectives of the project. And the focus is to generate an enduring and world-class step change in the transdisciplinary capability of the UK marine policy stakeholder and research community to use diverse values in decision-making to support the sustainable management of UK's marine resources. So I hope there that you can kind of already see where that kind of synergy is. In the WetlandLIFE project, we've spent 3 or 4 years thinking about diverse values and sort of working through ideas of interdisciplinarity, drawing together a broad team with lots of different elements. But here in the SMMR project, we want to take that sort of diverse values very directly into policy, decision-making, governance, etc. And that's something we didn't do in the WetlandLIFE project. So I think that there is a kind of continuity here. In the SMMR project, we've got 5 work packages revolving around conceptualizing diverse values, making them visible, reviewing existing approaches and making diverse values visible, particularly through some more creative approaches. Again, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that later. How to embed that in ocean literacy, how to embed diverse values in marine governance, and then crucially, how to take all of this and implement that in a transition program for marine policy stakeholders. And we're working across Shetland Islands, the River Severn and Chepstow, and Portsmouth, New Haven in a series of case study sites. So hopefully that's kind of given you a sense of the scope of the project. Moving on, next slide. And so just briefly then, before we get into our sort of discussion, just to say, well, what do we mean by diverse values? So we're kind of drawing here from the, certainly in our SMMR project, initially on the IPBES work. That's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they've produced a very good guide on talking about diverse values, what they are. And they go through things like a value being a principle, a preference, the importance of something, but also value being a measure as well. So you can sort of go from everything from thinking about the value of, say, the measuring biodiversity, the abundance of biodiversity measurements, let's say, that being a value, through to, say, the cultural value of the importance of something to someone's identity, for instance. So diverse values can stretch across different domains, from the natural sciences, from the economics, into the social sciences, and also, as we'll see, into the arts as well. And within that, then, we can sort of recognize fundamental different types of value, like instrumental value, intrinsic value, and relational values. And they're sort of depicted in that diagram of the right, the IPBES diagram of kind of nature, biodiversity, and ecosystems, those being the sort of the intrinsic values and the sort of biodiversity measurements, etc. Nature's benefits to people, they're more the kind of instrumental values, how useful nature is to people, good quality of life, human well-being, and those perhaps more sort of focusing on the relational values. So we've got a nice scope. And then in the SMMR project, we're dealing a little bit more with the socio-cultural values, the economic values, and ecological values as well. So moving on, next slide. And so just briefly about inter and transdisciplinarity then. And this, I mean, this, so I think since the early 2000s, there's been over 250 books published on interdisciplinarity. To say it is a hot topic, I think would be an underestimate. I think there's lots of use of the term interdisciplinarity. There's lots of way it's, used by different people in different contexts. Just 2 examples there from our previous Valuing Nature programme that WetlandLIFE was part of, demystifying interdisciplinary working, which was put together by Professor Nicola Beaumont, which is a great kind of overview of disciplinarity and the different types. So particularly in it's related to baking, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So thinking about how different, I think it was apple pies or whatever, and crumbles and things can be used to represent different types of disciplinarity, which I think are wonderful metaphors, through to the valuing an arts and arts-based research, which is where if you're kind of interested in particularly kind of making that crossing over from the sort of the sciences into those more kind of qualitative arts-based approaches, some useful sort of guides. So interdisciplinary is a widely used term to describe different ways that disciplines kind of mix, match, and meld together to create different outputs. And what I really want to do then in the next 15-20 minutes is just sort of talk through some of our experiences on the WetlandLIFE program. So next slide, please. I just put this here as a bit of a placeholder. I'm not going to talk about this, but because this is being recorded, I thought, it's being recorded. That means people can pause it. So if people are interested and you're watching this at a later date on a recording, then you can pause it at this point. And this is just some of the kind of things that we wrote about in our final report, and we summarized it under the idea of epistemological equality, i.e. trying to bring a kind of an equity between the contributions from different disciplines around the table in a large funded a project. And I think we'll kind of come back to some of these sort of foundational ideas that we talked about a bit later. So this is really for people watching in the future who want to pause. So if we can move on. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea then what WetlandLIFE is, what the SMMR Diverse Values project is, and a little bit of a take on diverse values and interdisciplinarity. So the next sort of 15 minutes or so, I'd like to spend in a little bit of a conversation between myself, Victoria, and Francis, and kind of get our kind of reflections on different aspects of the process of, if you like, doing interdisciplinarity in a large project. And the graphic that you see there in front of you is something that we came up with during the project because it reflected our experiences. I think to some extent we were sort of in the left-hand box at the start of the project, where we were thinking about ecosystem services, valuing nature, and we were kind of thinking about how we could draw the arts-based research into this. When we did that and we got the artists on board, oh boy, the dynamic and the change in the project and the change in the kind of the synergies between the different people working in the project was, I think, really quite profound. And so we sort of had this planning the party together, which is kind of where we ended up. So perhaps if I could just start by asking Francis or Victoria, when at the start of the process, when you were sort of joining the team, how did you, perhaps Victoria, if I can just kick it off with you, how did you feel at the start, and sort of how did you join the team?
Yep. As Tim mentioned, I was kind of the artists were invited into the project, and it began as an open call to artists. And I came across this. Most writers are often on the lookout for creative opportunities. And so I was engaged in that process, looking for residencies and anthology invites, etc. And I happened to come across the open call on the Creative Arts Scotland website. And it kind of appealed for me for two reasons. The first was that it was about wetlands. And I just finished writing a novel which was looking at the cultural associations of the Thames. And I just started a PhD looking at hydrogeographical spaces in literature and folklore. So wetlands certainly appealed from the offset, but also what really appealed for this project was that WetlandLIFE was kind of challenging the dominant narrative that exists around mosquitoes and wetlands. Wetlands and mosquitoes are often kind of maligned in our cultural consciousness, seen with quite negative connotations. And the call really appealed to me because it was trying to kind of champion and promote the value of wetlands and mosquitoes. And my background in English literature, I was very interested in the canon and narrative, and thinking about how being open to different ways of thinking and different perspectives, different voices certainly appealed. So coming on board, it was an open call to artists, and then I applied for that position. I submitted an application. And I think I was one of quite a number of people, and I was selected for interview, and where I met the team. I think if it wasn't for the direction that the WetlandLIFE journey kind of took with everybody else, I think challenging the narratives became a really dominant thread in my own work. But perhaps it wouldn't have developed in quite the same way if it hadn't have been for those interdisciplinary kind of workings that took place. So I wondered actually, Tim, maybe to throw that back at you, why did you think about why did the artists come into the project slightly at a later date?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So an art element was in the project right from the beginning. So, you know, right in our original aims and objectives, there was an art element written into that. But I think it was in the early stages of the project, as we were having project meetings, as we were discussing it amongst ourselves, we realized actually there was a lot more scope for how the arts could be used within the program that we hadn't really realized before. And I think once we realized that, then we sort of set about starting to sort of plug that gap. And we had over 80 applications for two artist positions on the project. So I think it sort of started to, it started off with a kind of realization of what the potential might be of bringing the arts more centrally involved in the project, and then starting to deal with that in a practical sense. So Victoria, Francis, you were kind of central in the project to this point. Can you perhaps just say a little bit about what your experience was at this early stages?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an ecologist and insect behaviourist by training, although Tim and I have collaborated on sort of more qualitative work before WetlandLIFE, which is kind of interesting in itself and maybe something we'll come back to. But I'd never kind of collaborated with the arts and humanities before. I had worked with social scientists. In pretty much every project I've done before, there's been some degree of interdisciplinarity, but never with the arts. So the process of kind of recruiting and working really closely with artists was completely new to me, and really challenged, my assumptions about what we would get at the end of it. So I kind of went in thinking, okay, we'll have a painting or a piece of music or a poem, something tangible, discrete that could go in a book or an exhibition somewhere. And having seen this kind of deluge of 80, 90 applications and going through this very diverse set of portfolios and applications, obviously it wasn't as straightforward as that. So one of the things I had to sort of come to grips with, which was slightly uncomfortable, was the possibility that we wouldn't actually know what we were going to get. So some of the other artists that we involved in the project, Kerry Morrison and Helmut Lemke, they are performative artists, and their kind of big angle was that they're going to work with us and we're going to work with them, and we do not know where that's going to go. And I was just thinking, this feels so wrong, with my experience of project writing and grant writing, and you have to have a kind of clear deliverable. So going into that and not knowing what we would have from working with Kerry and Helmut at the end of the project was very uncomfortable to start with, but I think really powerful, because having that scope to be flexible allowed something completely unexpected to emerge, and also to really draw out and start to create values as well as just document the values that we could find with the communities that we were working with the landscapes that we were working in. So that was a completely different experience to the one that I was expecting, I think.
I think that's brilliant. And I think that really represents that sort of early move into this idea of epistemological equality, of having a respect for everyone's different practice. We've all got different rules, different procedures, different areas that we subscribe to, and to actually be sort of sitting around the table and really trying to learn from each other and really trying to put ourselves into the sort of places of others who are perhaps coming at things from a slightly different perspective. I think the other thing that was a take home for me is the danger of thinking about talking about the arts as if you can talk about that in one breath, as if it's one thing. And you've got music, you've got theatre, you've got performance, you've got painting of different disciplines, all operating differently, all operating in different ways potentially, and being able to take on board those kind of ideas. So I think that was an important lesson we learned. Can we move on to the next slide? Next slide. Oh, brilliant. And so I suppose then just a few minutes then on sort of perhaps just sort of thinking about a little bit about, we've already touched upon these a little bit, but our sort of personal and disciplinary reflections. So I think, Francis, you've already started saying that you perhaps had some preconceptions there about what to expect. Do you want to develop that at all, or add anything to that?
Yes, so I was just thinking about something that we did working as a group across the disciplines. Bear in mind that we also have economists working in the project, public health specialists, social scientists, cultural scientists. So one thing we got everybody to do, and everybody did do, was to kind of make just an A4, take an A4 sheet of paper and kind of sketch out your disciplinary process. And for example, for me, that was a very kind of traditional scientific method process. So it was a set of flowcharts, how you gather evidence and how you set up a hypothesis and how you test those things. So everybody did that, and they all came back wildly different and very unique. But also, I think two kind of interesting things came from that. Firstly, everybody drew in other things outside what we might have thought would have been their kind of strict or restricted disciplinary perspective. As individuals, we all have interest in different areas, different topics of study. It's not like we just come as purely representatives of a single field. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is there was so much in common between them, actually. Different ways of gathering evidence, different ways of evaluating that evidence, but nonetheless still a sense of rigor around that process. A lot of very similar drivers around curiosity, like we're driven to understand what's happening around us, to be curious and to ask questions and to challenge assumptions a lot of the time. So I think having that was a really useful process to understand a little bit more about how these other disciplines are working, and what we have in common perhaps is almost more important than the ways that our disciplines are different. And I think for me it was really valuable to see that arts-based research can produce and does produce valuable evidence. It has its own rigor, it has its own approach. And I think that feeds into the idea of equality across the different disciplines. They're all valuable ways of knowing, and you cannot simply look through one lens to understand these really complex environments.
I think that's exactly right. And from my perspective, I kind of remember sitting around the table at project meetings, and while you've got disciplines, and disciplines are kind of they're written into textbooks, they're written into the journal papers we publish, they're written into the kind of the rules of the game. Actually, they're embedded in physical departments. You think about, you walk onto a university, you turn left for the art department, you turn right for the science department. There's physical things that encode the disciplinarity. But when it comes down to it, we were just a bunch of people around a table that had curiosity in what everyone was doing. And it was that people behind the disciplines and working with people that I think was really important. What about you, Victoria?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that example, actually, Francis, because I found that to be one of a really enriching activity in the process. And I think, coming from an arts perspective, I was really intrigued at the way that the team was conceptualizing the way we work. And I found that really interesting to be involved in. And that particular activity, to try and in one image summarize your practice, was a real challenge. And I think I opted in the end for a palimpsest, a kind of layering. So I had my initial kind of folklore research that I would carry out, overlaid with my walking practice, and then my final output. But even thinking through the way that we conceptualize our workings together in a project like this, I found really very rewarding. And I think it reflected a lot in the kind of interventions I ended up carrying out in the project. We also talked a lot about kind of narrative journey of the project. And I was kind of able to bring across some of my, as you mentioned, Francis, kind of my own methodological thinking. So I was able to bring in some narratology And that was really exciting to. I had also come to the table, although we were late to the party, we had an equal place at the table, but I did come, I worried that there would be kind of preconceptions, maybe epistemological hierarchies, and actually that was dispelled quite quickly. We all had an equal place, and there was, I got the impression there was a real value in us all sharing our different methodologies and approaches, and that they all, were kind of valued equally, which was really important. And I just to reiterate the kind of mutual curiosity, Frances was very generous in allowing us to come and visit her in the mosquito labs, which informed my creative writing. I ran a creative writing workshop in the Avalon Marshes, which involved using bird hides as spaces where the rest of the team, who maybe had not had an opportunity to engage in creative writing before, were able to come along and spend some time writing. So I think we also kind of tentatively began to kind of shadow and trespass into each other's disciplines. And that kind of gave us a better understanding of how each of us work, and kind of enriched our own processes as well.
France is just showing a few images of your bird hides. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yes.
Victoria?
Yeah, so the bird hide kind of again evolved organically. I mean, Kerry and Helmut were real advocates, as you mentioned, for it kind of being a journey. We kind of all set out to do certain things on a project, but then that kind of evolved. And I found myself writing quite a lot in bird hides in the Somerset levels, where I was helping a social scientist on our project conduct some community filmed interviews. And while I was there, I was doing my own writing and ducking out of the rain quite frequently. And I discovered bird hides as being these really amazing spaces to write and to reflect and to think about the connections between nature and narrative. And with working with the reserve managers, we requisitioned 2 bird hides and were able to install some story corners. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a kind of a board, and it contains story prompts. There's creative writing exercises, postcards that feature poems from poets. And the idea was that visitors would go into the bird hide, they would be inspired by the activities, and then using a blank postcard, they would write something, a piece, a poem or a reflection, and deposit it into the box. And at intervals, I would come and collect all of these postcards, and I digitized them on the WetlandLIFE website. And we had near enough 300 contributions from members of the public. And I know I'm kind of jumping ahead to talk about the way we create value, but actually this was a really amazing activity because it reasserted the value of place for people that went there. But the process of reflecting through art on the process of thinking about place, on observing and thinking about your connection to landscape, also created value. So it was a really worthwhile activity. And some of the postcards that we received were featured in the pop-up word hide that you now see on the screen, which was kind of like a way to showcase what was going on in the Avalon Marshes, but in a kind of curated exhibition space at the Royal Geographical Society. But also, interestingly, within the exhibition kind of functioned as a kind of screened off space to allow for further observation and reflection on this connection with nature. So, yeah. Brilliant.
That's great. Can you just show a picture of the wetlands on wheels, Francis? So this was the other contribution from Kerry Morrison and Helmut Lemke, who are if you like, I think they describe themselves as socially engaged artists, working with socially engaged art, where the performance is very much the art. And so this was about taking everything from the project, so literally information from the mosquitoes, from the economics, from this community voice method we were doing, and creating this wonderful caravan that became this sort of mobile hub for interdisciplinarity. Actually, I mean, that caravan was the product of all the kind of contributions that was, and that in the project, and that was facilitated by 2 artists, but their specific contribution, I think, was in the process of engagement. And so we got to engage with wetlands, with the general public, etc., in a way that we just would not have done if we hadn't had them on board in the project, and actually allowed their practice to emerge alongside the others in the project, and that was a really enriching experience.
I'm just going to add to that, like, you know, I work with mosquitoes. There's not exactly a mosquito fan club, but this kind of, it wasn't so much about, you know, setting out with the mission to, you know, change hearts and minds, but the responses that we had from the public were like completely different to the kind of dominant narratives that we see in, you know, kind of the tabloid press. Every year there's, you know, 3 or 4 articles. As soon as we get a heat wave or, you know, heavy rain in summer, then there's always an article about killer mosquitoes. And, you know, that kind of it has trickled down into, you know, some of the kind of wider thinking and narratives around mosquitoes in British wetlands. But this really, really challenged that. And, you know, we had several people walking away every time they'd spoken to Kerry and Helmet thinking, oh, you know, and saying back to us, oh, you know, I feel a bit sorry for them, you know, they're just hungry, you know, it really started to open the conversation space to go into what is actually quite a nuanced topic. There are a lot of subtle details that are really important and really glossed over in a lot of other kind of engagement activities around you know, the disvalue that's associated with mosquitoes.
And I think that was an important general point then, that our experiences of the way that the arts-based research practices in WetlandLIFE were opening up spaces for deliberation, for dialogue, and for sharing perspectives, points of view in a way that perhaps a social science kind of more qualitative work wouldn't have done. So I think that was really interesting. Can we go back to the main slides? So just moving on then to next slide. So I think we were sort of going through a journey of kind of measuring values, assessing values, deliberating values, creating values. And then we kind of came to the sort of this sort of the disciplinary transgression. So where is the interdisciplinarity? And what we wanted to do in WetlandLIFE was really try and show that although the whole project was notionally interdisciplinary, it was really happening throughout the project in different ways at different times. And so we tried to characterize the interdisciplinary processes, if you like, touch points in the project. So, you know, why were they happening? When were they happening? Who are they happening between? How were they happening? And so what? You know, what was the added value? How had this changed practice from a multidisciplinary into an output that was somehow interdisciplinary? And perhaps one of the main elements of this was the final exhibition. I mean, I'm sure there was lots of other examples. Do you want to talk about any examples of interdisciplinary touch points that either of you kind of think were important or experienced?
Yeah, I was going to bring up the exhibition, and also, I mean, personally working with the community voice method, the interview, the social science interview process was really quite formative in the direction that I took then subsequently with my creative writing interventions and my own stories that I produced. But as you mentioned, the exhibition was kind of like all the composite parts of a project amalgamated to showcase how we'd all kind of interacted with one another. And for that, I also worked with the economists quite closely, and they'd produced some scenarios based on climate change futures. And I used and in order to do that, they were actually playing around with narrative. They had to use narrative, a narrative frame, in order to tell that story about these 4 different potential outcomes. And we worked quite closely, and I was able to create some flash fiction pieces based on those scenarios. Because we, you know, creative writing, you know, it deals with similar territory. It's about speculation and imagination, and that was a really rewarding, I think, collaboration between the two of us as well. So I think that there were lots of echoes within each other's work, and lots of areas where we weren't even realizing that we were kind of already employing aspects of each other's practices in the way that we were perhaps showcasing some of our findings. So
Thanks.
yeah.
we're starting to run out of time a little bit. We're gonna definitely run over. So if it's okay with Elizabeth, we're going to run to about 45 minutes, if that's okay. Francis, do you want to just reflect on anything as a natural scientist going into this process?
Yeah, I think certainly, I mean, there was a lot happening and kind of crossways between all of the different disciplines. So we, as an entomologist, I work quite closely with the historian, Peter Coates from the University of Bristol, and he really changed what he was doing after discussions with entomologists at Public Health England, who turned up with a sort of an amazing collection of sort of historic artifacts. You can just see on the right here, these 100-year-old mosquito specimens, and that really kind of fueled his interest in this topic. But something that, just as the arts were really powerfully disruptive in a very helpful and constructive way by being in our project meetings, because they would ask questions, and I think every other person at some point in those meetings would go, oh, I hadn't, never really thought about it like that before, or that's a really good question and I actually don't have the answer, So that, having arts as part of the project, incredibly powerful across the board, but having them as a sort of outside voice also, at the table, but slightly different, was really disruptive in a very good way.
I completely agree with that, and I do have memories of how much respect I had for the fearless way the artists in WetlandLIFE were happy to cross all the different subject boundaries, where, I sort of like, for much of my academic career, I've kind of like always been apologizing. So I'm not a specialist in this, I'm not a specialist in that. I'm not really feeling like I could have much of a say, if you like, or a view, but actually, the way they were able to move across those. Anyway, that's brilliant. Can we go back to the main slides? Hopefully that's kind of given you some sort of flavour of the kind of interdisciplinary kind of conversations that we were having. It was, as I said, all came sort of to a head. We joined with another project called CoastWeb, another interdisciplinary project, and we had that final exhibition, etc. And you can read up a lot of this in the final report if you need more information. I think what I'd like to do is just move on. If I can have the next slide. And I'd like to perhaps just say a little of the last 5 minutes, perhaps just say something about how this is sort of translating then into our current SMMR project. So here we're trying to kind of conceptualize the links between diverse values and decision makings and frameworks. We've got that idea about values as principles, decision making and frameworks, and that there are links between these separate areas. Next slide. And just drawing out from that then, perhaps thinking about values as a process. So values not just in terms of a measurement, a single measurement that can feed into some sort of metric, but values as a process. They can be quantitatively measured, they can be elicited through qualitative means, resulting in deliberative discussions, arts-based research, contributing to that alongside qualitative social science. That can result in negotiation of values. In other words, values are changing, values are sharing. And there's a lot of work on this. If you go to the ecosystem services literature, look up shared values, deliberative values, the work of people like Jasper Kenter, they've done a huge amount of brilliant work on this. And then, but also recognizing very clearly that values are being changed in this process. We're talking about interventions here in discussions, and we're talking about value creation. And so value is a process spanning these different elements: measurement, elicitation, negotiation, creation. And we're trying to reflect that in the current SMMR project. So next slide. And so we're working with sort of biophysical values, economic values, and sociocultural values. And part of our second work package, which is making different values visible across the Shetland Islands, Chepstow and the Severn, and Portsmouth, is we're doing a review of existing approaches. So looking at those biophysical economic values, but then we're thinking perhaps, well, are there values that have missed, perhaps from those harder to listen to groups in society, and using a mixture of social science, qualitative and creative methods, including community voice method, digital storytelling, forum theatre, photo essays, in order to draw out some of those different types of values in ways that perhaps are difficult to do unless you're using more creative approaches. And so we're eliciting values around instrumental values, how useful environments are to people, the intrinsic values of those environments, but then the relational values, how people's identity is formed as a relationship between the coast and the sea, how important the sea is for fishers, for instance, to be in terms of forging their identity, thinking about those relational values, creating spaces for those deliberation, and then very clearly recognizing about value creation. Next slide. And then into that though, because in the SMMR project, we are concerned about practical change in the real world. And that's a real focus for us. And recognizing we've got lots of frameworks like natural capital, ecosystem services, socio-ecological systems. So to think about how are values already embedded in those frameworks? Do those frameworks encourage the use of some values at the expense of other values? I mean, we know that ecosystem services, if you go back 20 years, was founded very much upon ecological and natural sciences, sorry, economics and natural sciences. Over the last 15 years or so, social sciences has played a much bigger role. Loads of socio-cultural value study now as part of ecosystem services. But I would say, and the arts-based research, that's become slightly later to the game. And that's, you know, a little bit, that's perhaps just been the last more few years on ecosystem services, but it is changing. So how these different frameworks are themselves communicating different values. Next slide. And then taking that into decision making, that IPBES recognises that institutions are value articulating entities. You have to work perhaps by statutory rules. There are thick rules and procedures you have to follow that emphasise certain types of evidence and information over others. Does that mean that some types of values get listened to more clearly than others? Evidence-based policy making. What implications does that have in terms of the values that are listened to? Are elected or non-elected people making decisions? How important is that in terms of values? So I think that we're exploring in the SMMR project some of these interrelationships. Next slide. Almost at the final slide here. And so that's how we're kind of conceiving the project at the moment. These diverse values frameworks and in governments, how that's interacting in the case studies through the public stakeholders and institutions, how we're using transdisciplinary and narrative approaches in order to kind of capture that. And then beyond that, I won't talk about it now, but how we're actually trying to sort of almost take a meta view of understanding new ways of looking at those connections through assemblage theory. Next slide. And just finally to plug, final slide, just to plug, if any of you are interested in art-based approaches and decision-making, I am involved in another project called ALERT, Arts and Artists in Landscape and Environmental Research Today. And we're in the process of planning a final end of project event for that. So if you're interested, do please get in touch. I think there's some interesting things emerging out of the project, not least of the way that arts can deepen and add complexity to understanding, how we can build empathy, shape social discourses, etc., etc. I'm afraid we've gone a bit over our 40 minutes, so thank you for being tolerant of us for that. And I think we've probably got a bit of time for some questions.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, a really interesting talk and discussion, and it was great to kind of just hear more insights to that. And we've got a couple of questions as well. So the first one is, how do you manage the fact that you don't have clear deliverables for a project in terms of reporting to funders and other project partners?
Do you want me to take that first of all? I think we had a clear deliverable in the bid, so that everything that we were doing within the bid was in the envelope of that of what we said we would do. So when we said we didn't have clear deliverables, it was more to do with the mechanism of delivering something. But it was certainly the case that we knew what we wanted to, where the endpoint was that we wanted to go to. We were just less sure about the mechanism by which we got there, and we were able to be reflective during the project. And it did require a few changes to the project, which we went through the sort of various channels to make sure that we did. But we, so we try to be reflective about, and not just kind of continue on with sort of tunnel-like vision and say, oh, you know, this is absolutely what we're doing. As long as it was within the envelope of what we said we'd do, then we allowed ourselves a little bit of flexibility within the programme to be able to ensure that we could get at that that final point, but through a little bit of creative imagination in that process.
Get myself unmuted there. Great. Next question was, did you have any moments of conflict when working across or between disciplines, and then how did you navigate that, if that was so?
To one of my, Frances, Victoria, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't think we did. One of the beautiful things about the project, which is kind of impossible to engineer actually, it just so happened that everybody who was involved came with a really open mind. We all listened to each other. We had really good lines of communication, and that foundational respect, which I think is really essential to working across disciplines. There was no ego, and there was no hierarchy. I mean, we were lucky in that the program was funded essentially across pretty much all the research councils, so that there wasn't kind of like, we have to focus on the natural science or the social science or the arts. It was, work together and see what you can do. So I don't recall any kind of falling outs or even really major disagreements, professionally in the project, which I think is really testament to the bringing together of a really great team, and Tim's leadership and being able to kind of have conversations with everybody and allow conversations between everybody to take place in a really respectful way.
I think that point actually just made about the funding coming from across all the different research councils was super important, because it really did feel like that gave a proper justification to being able to draw in these different approaches, etc., and say, well, look, we're being funded by the different research councils, therefore these different approaches and methods need to be represented and need to be listened to. And I would totally echo Frances there. I'm not sure if we were just lucky on the project, but there really wasn't kind of big, it really wasn't a sort of sense of big kind of egos trying to drive things forward in a certain way, and it was very much a collaborative venture. And yeah, Victoria, what was your feeling of that?
Yeah, I've had a glance at the next question, and with Frances talking about hierarchies and the nature of the kind of team itself, and I feel even though there were less of us artists involved, I feel like the project meetings created a space and a platform, and we were given a platform quite early on to share our practice, and I think that was really important, because that dispelled maybe potentially the preconceptions people might have about artists. As Tim mentioned, Kerry and Helmut work in a very different way to the way I work, and that was really important to emphasize, that we were going off in different directions and we were doing different things, but there isn't a one size fits all with whatever artist you're going to involve in a project. But I think having a lot of time in project meetings to really to allow for the discussion and to allow for sharing of each other's approaches, and to be open in being to facilitate shadowing opportunities, I think was really integral to it creating quite a conducive environment for us to work together effectively.
And can I just add one point to that I think is really super important, that a lot of in terms of getting this sort of interdisciplinary collaboration together, it wasn't just we had formal project meetings that were minuted, etc., but it was almost in the spaces and the cracks around that conversations could happen, inspirational conversations. So in the coffee breaks, in the spaces after the meetings, in the dinners, if you were staying and having a meeting over 2 or 3 days. And actually I think one thing I have missed a lot over the COVID time is those face-to-face engagements, and I do worry sometimes that there is a danger if you're not having those those spaces for those little intimate conversations, those face-to-face things, then this type of those interdisciplinary collaborations where you're kind of like, just exploring with other people, on a much more informal basis, what they're doing, why they're doing it. But you're kind of changing the way you're thinking as a result of that potentially. So I do think, and you can't really do that on Zoom. And don't get me wrong, Zoom is fantastic. It's, it has offered up so many new opportunities, but I do think there's a really important value in those face-to-face encounters and meetings, and have the spaces in between the more formal structures in a project.
And can I just follow on from that by picking up a point in the questions about non-scientists sort of prioritising, or perhaps being more inclined to listen to scientists. So we had a steering group from organisations like RSPB, Wildfowl Wetland Trust, the Environment Agency, a few others as well. And actually, I don't know if this is how you recall it as well, I would say they were probably more interested in the non-kind of traditional science understanding of values, because I think they recognised what we were doing in the project is actually probably more powerful at tapping into something in the wider communities that are around the places that we were working in, our specific case study sites, or creating ways of looking at values that people care about. There can be tons of evidence for climate change, for example, but actually making people do anything about it's a bit difficult sometimes, So I think they were really interested and receptive to hearing about these diverse values, not at the expense of anything else, but actually starting that understanding that you kind of have to have these layers. There are so many different things that are happening in our kind of complex landscapes, and they, I think, recognise they've been missing something, and that projects like this are starting to explore those missing aspects.
Great. We've had another question pop in, which kind of relates to what you've been talking about, but maybe a bit more specific, about whether there was like a power imbalance in the WetlandLIFE project involving how you kind of artists and scientists and where the money kind of got distributed, and then how you're addressing that in the SMMR. It's added with the comment, you were clearly managing to do it. So I think it's more on a positive note.
Well, I suppose in terms of power, I should maybe defer initially to my colleagues to respond to that. I don't know how you felt, but maybe from Francis first of all.
Well, between all, so Tim and I were quite heavily involved in, we wrote a large part of the initial bid and the budgets, working with the different disciplines. And I don't think any of us had worked so directly with artists in a UKRI funded, quite traditional project before, and because we didn't have that network at the beginning of the project, when we were setting up the budgets, obviously we'd go to the economists and they would say, well, we need this, and natural scientists and social sciences, we need this, and then we had to kind of work out that aspect ourselves, and on that basis we did underfund it. I think if we had time again, I would like to have allocated more money for the arts. But the beauty of the project was that it enabled us to start that process of expanding our network. Now I know if I ever have the opportunity to do a project like this again, I know the people that I can go to, I know the networks that I can go to start reaching out to those people at the beginning of the project, rather than partway through and saying, well, this is what you've got, what can you do with it? Tim, I don't know what you think.
Well, I would just like to say one clear example now. And it was that kind of learning that directly has helped us with the SMMR project and how we put that together. And I just point to Victoria's position as a research fellow now on SMMR, which is just absolutely fantastic. We've got someone with a kind of creative writing experience there who's working as an absolute central point within kind of the whole project, and is again, like she did in WetlandLIFE, helping us to direct and shape the ways that we're doing and thinking about things on the SMMR project. So, sorry, Victoria, I don't want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's and I do feel very privileged to be involved in a project like this. I think artists, I'm counting myself as an artist. My background's in English literature and folklore as well, so I kind of feel like my own practice is very interdisciplinary. But we kind of exist around the periphery often of projects like this, and we want to be involved, but there isn't always the mechanisms to get us, into the inner circle. So, and even in terms of our writing, having the opportunity to talk to entomologists like Francis. I would in a previous life have been emailing people like you, Francis, saying, please, would you have a conversation with me? And there I was able to go to mosquito labs and to experience that firsthand. So I think, just creating these opportunities and casting the net wider, I think has been really enriching, I think, for all of us artists that were involved on the project, and hopefully for other similar projects in the future.
That's fantastic. Oh, it's so nice to hear such a positive experience and then it's fed into that. If you guys are, I mean, we're coming up to 2 o'clock, but if you are happy to answer the last 2 questions, if that's fine, a couple of minutes. Yeah. Someone has asked, is there a feature of our wetlands that has not yet been used or hardly realised? For example, now I'm struggling to read, metrication device on climate change and humidity temperature decline, or have records on this have been kept, and should we be keeping them?
I mean, I've got a specific answer because I'm not a kind of a wetland hydrologist. So that would probably be the right person to approach for that kind of question. But in terms of features that have not been used outside of perhaps the more physical aspects, topography or relations to climate change or carbon sequestration. Aside from that, I think one thing that we found very clearly throughout the project, and especially on those postcards that people filled in at the word hides that Victoria created, was just how embedded people are in these landscapes. That people would be creative on those postcards, they'd share anecdotes, local history, memories, folk tales, reading recommendations, or just, a kind of visitor comment in, this is an amazing place to visit. So I think that kind of community engagement with wetlands, it hasn't really been quantified. It hasn't been captured how important that is to just, everyday people, going out and enjoying and being in wetland environments.
I think that element of wetlands as being, sounds a bit jargony, but multifunctional spaces. I mean, they're places, and they're deeply embedded into people and communities. And certainly that it came out even in the photo essay that was done in wetlands about, seeing wetlands as places of memory. You can see that in the physical landscape, places of leisure, workplaces, places for animals, places for others. And that, they really are, all that, we use one term, wetlands, and that even aside from any ecological differences between different types of wetlands, just from a sort of cultural perspective, you can really start to explore the diversity of different ways that we understand wetland places, which is fascinating. Great.
Okay, one last question. Someone said, this is fascinating, thank you. As a biologist, there's lots of language from the arts world that is new to me. What advice would you give in terms of working and making sure you all understand each other's meanings?
Well, go on, Tim.
No, you go ahead.
I suppose there's a kind of I found myself in exactly the same situation starting, with WetlandLIFE. I didn't have access to the terminology. I had to learn, and to kind of figure out what was being said, and had to read around. But I think just asking questions and being open to the process certainly really helped. And I think we did have a very encouraging and nurturing team that didn't allow for, if you didn't make you feel bad if you asked a silly question. And I think that was really important. So I think it works both ways. I think we're all in the process of learning.
Yeah, absolutely. But everyone just talking in a language that everyone can understand, not trying to hide behind lots of jargon and privileged knowledge, if you like, just being able to chat really. And I think that's partly why we kind of wanted to do this webinar in the way that we did, as a kind of conversation between the three of us, to give a little bit of a sense of that sort of just sort of sharing ideas and sort of sharing perspectives.
And just make sure you give yourself time. Like learning anything new, and you just need a bit more time to get your head around some of the concepts and the approaches. And yeah, we're just going in with kind of an open mind to what's going on out there. And like Victoria says, just asking questions. It's the only way to learn. Really.
And maybe not judging things from your disciplinary perspective. So being open, I suppose. Yeah, open to different ideas. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. That was a really fascinating talk, and I am so pleased that it kicked off the SMMR webinar series with such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for giving up your time to do this for us today.
Well, thank you very much for having us all.
No problem. That's great. I'm just gonna, so everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. I'm just gonna put up a slide of the upcoming dates of our webinar series. And our next one will be next Wednesday. And I've dropped the sign up link for that in the chat below. And so we hope to see you either in the next webinar series or potentially at the conference, which is also coming up very soon. But apart from that, again, just another thank you to everyone and our speakers, and we will see you in our next webinar session. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.